Hi, everybody. I'm here with the academic agent. This is King Crocoduck slash King or Crocoduck of Logs. Uh, yeah, we're doing a live stream to chat about this book by Thomas Sowell. It's called The Vision of the Anointed. And Agent, why don't you tell us a little bit about
Yes. Well, thanks for having me, first of all. And yeah, so Thomas Sowell is a chap who's written a lot of books. I think it's 45 plus books, maybe. But he wrote in 1987. He wrote a book called A Conflict of Visions, and I actually made a video a couple of weeks back summarizing that. But basically, in the conflict of visions, he argues that most of our political conflicts, our ideological conflicts, come from a clash between two very different ways of looking at the world. On the one hand, you have the constrained vision, which basically believes that human beings are constrained by their natures. We are selfish, we are greedy, we're self-interested, and there's nothing we can do about it, basically. So society exists in many ways to keep those baser instincts in check. Whereas against the unconstrained or the utopian vision, where there are basically no limits on human potential. They believe that human beings are perfectible, and really the thing that is holding us back is society. So if only we could change society, we could change everything. People would change as society changed. So you can see, some nature nurture stuff in the background of those two different visions. And then he writes a follow-up to that book, which is the book that we're talking about now, called The Vision of the Anointed, where he looks at the unconstrained or the utopian vision in much more detail. And really, what I thought the interesting thing that he does in this book is that he charts how the political left, in most of these cases, has made us. They always say he spots a pattern. Okay, and there's 4 stages to this pattern: the crisis, the solution, the results, and the response. And one of the things this book does is it shows that there's always some sort of crisis, whether it's poverty, or there's always some big urgent problem that we need to fix now. And in Sowell's view, that problem is always way overstated. The problem is never as bad as people make out. Then there's a solution. So let's say the solution is welfare, in one of the examples that he gives, which comes with a set of promises of benefits. And then there's a set of results, which are almost always the exact opposite of the promised benefits. And then there's the response, which in his view is always a kind of changing of the goalposts, or like, for example, when he talks about crime at one point, they basically, when it comes to measuring the results, they'll say something like, oh, well, it's actually very complex and unmeasurable. So what he says is that even in the face of evidence, people tend to double down on their vision, and evidence doesn't actually do anything to change people from their positions. They'll just find new and innovative ways to explain away the contrary results. Did I miss anything out? Would you like to add anything to that brief summary of the book?
Yeah, that's about right. And there's it's a little bit Cunnian. It's similar. I don't know if you've read Thomas Kuhn's book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions.
No, I haven't. No.
Well, his little historical pattern, it's kind of a mirror of what Kuhn was saying was happening in the scientific community. Or, well, actually, not quite that strong, but people interpreted Kuhn in a manner that sort of made it seem as though, okay, you have scientists coming out with this kind of way of doing things. They have what's called a stage of normal science. there's a model, a general hypothesis that they subscribe to, and a certain method of well, there's a certain paradigm. It's the orthodoxy for a time, but there comes
Sure.
a point. There's a crisis stage. It's called the crisis stage, like Sowell later wrote. This Kun book, by the way, was written in like the 60s or 70s, and Sowell's was in the 80s. So there's probably some
Sure.
influence there. But during the crisis stage, this orthodox way of doing science doesn't really work anymore. There are certain problems that the old way is no longer capable of solving. So scientists begin engaging in puzzle solving. They start to come out with all of these new crazy ideas, and eventually one of them takes hold. One of them is successful at solving these new problems, and scientists make this new one the new paradigm. You have the paradigm shift stage. And because of the way science textbooks are set up, they can't trace every single dead end that was taken by the scientific community. You can't say, okay, people tried this thing, and these are all of the lines of inquiry that they took and sort of the framework they were operating in, but it didn't work. So then they switched to this one and that one. The science textbooks can't operate like that. They need to teach the current paradigm in order to prepare them for research and prepare future scientists for what they're going to be learning.
Sure.
And some people take this way too far, and they interpret this as a kind of Whig history, and science is all just it's all socially constructed nonsense in accordance with power relations. But whatever. The point is, those who do hold that view charge science with revising its history of never really quite getting the truth, but always acting as though it did. And that's sort of similar to what Sowell is saying about high theory intellectuals, people who say, okay, here are the, this is the way things need to be. These are the solutions that we need to implement. And then afterwards, it doesn't work. They jump onto something else. They say, no. This thing that we implemented, it wasn't meant to do what we said it was meant to do. It achieved a certain goal that wasn't necessarily the goal that was achieved.
Sure.
Yeah.
No, but presumably the difference is that in science, the new paradigms that emerge, or the new dominant paradigms, are presumably based on some sort of empirical evidence, right? So, I mean, even if it's not the complete truth, there'll be some statistical reason for this becoming the new paradigm, right?
Yeah.
Whereas I think in Sowell, in his view, in his argument, there's never any reason to believe in the crisis in the first place. There's absolutely no reason to believe in the solution, i.e. no empirical evidence to think that the solution they've come up with exists. When it's tested by experience, the results are the polar opposite of what was promised. And then that does absolutely nothing to change the paradigm. So even though I can see the politics doesn't work like science, I guess, would be the thing to draw from that. Just before what we've done here, I've devised a set of questions that I'd like to ask you. What shall I call you? A Croc, or
just call me Casey?
Casey, okay. So I want to ask you a number of questions because we've both read this book and we wanted to have a talk about it. But just before I do that, the one thing I forgot to mention in my little summary there is that conflict of visions really kind of explains these two different visions and doesn't take a side. It almost kind of suspends judgment. It leaves it hanging. It doesn't come to any conclusions. Whereas in this book, I'm sure you'll agree, there is absolutely no doubt as to whose side Sowell is on. I mean, it's basically a polemic against the political left in America, specifically over the past 50 years. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. Let me see if I can characterize these two visions correctly. It seems to me one of these is the Hobbesian vision, the other one is the Rousseauian one.
That's basically correct. Sowell tends to use Adam Smith as the as the kind of torchbearer of the constrained vision, and he uses William Godwin as the. He does mention Rousseau, but he tends to use Godwin for some reason as his I guess main unconstrained thinker. Although I actually, as a scholar of the early modern period, would push it way back. I would say Machiavelli would be, I guess, the first prominent thinker in that tradition. And you can draw a straight line from Machiavelli to Hobbes, to people like Adam Smith, and then basically modern economists beyond that. And in the unconstrained vision, we'd have to start with John Locke, I think, as being the person who really argues from this position of human beings being a blank slate.
Yeah.
So this is basically this blank, the unconstrained vision is the blank slate idea that, human beings are not only a product of their time and place, but we're constantly able to improve ourselves. And I think like John Stuart Mill and various, this was a very big idea in the 19th century, that you could make yourself into whoever you wanted to be, without any constraints. So,
yeah. And to this day, basically the politics of the unconstrained vision of this day is, if we just change the institutions, if we just change the ideologies that are and the represented subcultures within these institutions, that we would end up molding and socializing people into a better, enlightened, more tolerant, and just state, and we would end up with a kind of utopia from there.
That's right. I mean, it's not a case of people are racist, so we need to work out ways of dealing with that. It's more, if we could only change society in this way, there'd be no more racists, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So, shall I go into these questions then?
Sure.
So the first one's very broad. What do you think were the most compelling and least compelling arguments that Sowell makes in this book?
Well, I really like the general bottom-up view that he takes of the way social structures work, as opposed to the up-down view taken by his opposition. This bottom-up view of, you have all of these social interactions that it's an almost kind of Tolstoyan view of history. If you recall from War and Peace, Tolstoy went on these long rants about how there is so much going on in history, so many pieces to the puzzle, that it's impossible to really make any determination about of causal influences between major historical incidents. It's too complicated. There's too many pieces that accumulate to build up this bottom-up view of history, as opposed to the top-down view. And as an example, he gave sort of, why did Napoleon lose the battle at let's see, was it Borodino?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, I think it was Borodino. So why did he lose the battle of Borodino? And the answer that was given by historians at the time was that it was because Napoleon had a cold and he wasn't able to, do as well. This is sort of the top-down view. There's the commander at the top who influences everything that takes place, down to every last action of every soldier. Whereas Tolstoy said, no, that's bullshit. What happened was there were all of these incidents taking place with, for instance, the temperature, the locations of the troops, how they were able to move through different kinds of terrain, how demoralized some soldiers were, and every individual soldier had this or that on his mind, and blah blah blah, and it all accumulates into this result that nobody was able to predict beforehand, and nobody was able to explain afterward to any real.
Yeah.
And
even I mentioned Machiavelli. He has a very strong. He calls it fortune. But he basically says you could be the best prince, you could be the best commander, you could have every single plan in the world, and you could still just 50% of everything. You just don't know what's going to happen. A river could flood its banks. There could be a fire in some small town. Basically, anything can ruin your plans on any given day. So, yes. The other example, I think, I'm not sure if Sowell mentions it in this book, but the famous one is the one that Milton Friedman gives, of the pencil. That
Yeah,
is,
mhm.
do you know it? It's basically that there's nobody on earth who could, if me and you had to sit down and think, how are we going to make a pencil? There's nobody on earth who has the knowledge required to all the manufacturing processes, all of the machinery, all of the kind of links in the market that are required to produce just the humble pencil are beyond any single person's understanding, which
Yeah.
is the basic idea.
Hmm.
Although as a scientist, would you disagree with that?
Well, I can imagine a way to educate a person, within all of these various fields, but it's kind of a waste of an education to learn how to just make a pencil from scratch.
Right.
It's kind of a reflection of why we need to live in a society. Um, you can't really do it alone. We're social creatures for a reason. We were
But
we were
yes, but the key is that it's not planned, right? Nobody kind of sat down and planned out all of the different links in the chain. It just kind of happens organically over time,
Yeah,
uh, which is the complete opposite of, I guess. I mean, like a socialist vision of the world is basically trying to plan an economy from the ground up,
yeah.
which is well, basically insane. Were there any other arguments you particularly liked in the book?
Well, I really liked a little quote he gave. Well, it wasn't really a quote. It was just he said he did not believe in solutions, only trade-offs. Uh,
Hmm.
I really like that. I think that's a very it's a very wise perspective to have. Um, so
And again, he says that that is characteristic of the constrained vision, and that is actually one of the things that I was going to ask you in this talk. Do you think that it's basic as anybody who believes in science, anybody who believes in evolution, for example, do you not have to some extent, if you believe in evolution, if you believe in science, to believe in the constrained vision? It seems to me that there just can't be any evidence for the unconstrained vision beyond wishful thinking.
well, this is why you have people, those who are the loudest advocates, at least in academia, of the unconstrained vision. These are the same people who absolutely loathe, just completely despise evolutionary psychology and behavioral genetics and all of these other things. They basically view these as the contemporary versions of eugenics and phrenology and craniometry and all this other nonsense. Um, I'll mention this in the video that I'll upload later, but uh, their kind of metric for whether something is scientific or not, whether a scientific study is legitimate or not, or whether news is fake or real, or whether it's education or indoctrination. The metric for that is not whether it meets some sort of objective standard for quality, which they don't believe exists. They're the
Mhm.
relativists, but on whether um, it helps them progress toward the vision of the anointed, their vision of the proper society.
Yeah,
If a scientific study or news piece doesn't support that, if it hinders progress toward their vision, then it's fake, and it's probably motivated by implicit biases and other deficiencies.
yeah. Oh, okay. So, were there any other particular arguments that you liked, or should we get on to? Because I'm almost more interested in the ones that you find least compelling, because I mean, one of the things that I found with this book is that I read it and I was like, yeah, I was with him basically all of the way,
Mhm.
and then I got to the end and I thought, I wonder if he was wrong about any of that. So, yeah, did you have the same experience, or were you more skeptical along the way?
Well, toward the beginning, I mentioned in one of our conversations this chart that he put up. Basically, I don't remember the details. I don't have the book in front of me. I returned it to the library. But
Yeah.
he imagined a society with the following plan, and it's a super equal society. It's almost utopian. It works like
Yeah.
this. Um, the point of this is to demonstrate, by the way, that income inequality is not rooted in this category of rich versus poor, but on age group. That the younger people are going to be poorer than the older people.
Yeah, I've
Uh,
got it here. I found it. It's on page 52. But carry on. Yep,
well, tell me if I'm correct. The people in the 20 to 30 age group make $10,000 a year. Yeah,
that's right. 10,000 annual income.
yeah. Then the people age 20 to 30 in this hypothetical society make 20,000 a year. Or
Yeah, 30 to 40. Yeah,
yeah,
30 years old, you earn 20K. Let's
yeah,
say.
yeah. And then when you turn 40, that doubles again. Now you make 40,000 a year. Yeah.
That's so it goes 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, going up
Oh,
in 10-year increments. That's it.
okay. And they save how much every year? Like 5,000?
So they go. So there's subsistence of 5K. I
Uh-huh.
guess that's how much they need to spend on their basic needs, and then they save annual savings 500 for the 20-year-old, 1,500 for the 30-year-old, 2,500 for the 40-year-old, 3,500 for the 50-year-old, and 4,500 for the 60-year-old.
Yeah.
And then at 70, there's naught annual income, 5,000 subsistence, and naught annual savings.
Yeah.
But
So
there's also lifetime savings as well.
yeah. So basically, the point is you have this hypothetical society where everybody within a certain age group makes the exact same amount of money. And then when they reach the higher age group, that they add $10,000. So you start with $10,000 when you're 20. When you turn 30, you make $20,000 a year. When you turn 40, you make $30,000 a year, and so on. Your entire life, you subsist on $5,000 a year,
Yeah.
and you save the remaining 5,000. No interest, right?
That's right. So the lifetime. So basically, you accumulate lifetime savings. So the 30-year-old has got 5K lifetime savings, whereas the 70-year-old has got 125K lifetime savings, and there are various increments in between.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what you end up from this super, almost communistic society is the people with the most money, the old people. Um, they have like half of the wealth, and they're the top 17%.
Right.
Um,
Well, it's kind of weird. If you do it on income, the 60 to 70-year-olds have like the top 2% income, whereas the 70-year-olds show up in poverty stats, which is his point, I guess. But
yeah,
because they have naught, by the time you retire, you have naught income, even though you have huge lifetime savings.
yeah. Well, here's my issue with this. I think it's a little bit misleading, because what's effectively happening is the percentage of the income is increasing drastically every 10 years. You start with a certain income in your 20s, then in your 30s, that income doubles. And then when you're in your 50s, the income doubles again. If you do, the average American household is like $50,000 a year.
Yeah.
Um, so let's start a little bit below the average. Let's say a family in its 20s starts by making 40,000 a year. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and then when when the heads of the family turn 30, now they're making $80,000 a year. You add 40,000 to that. And then when they turn 40, they're making 120,000 a year. When they turn 50, they're making 160,000 a year. I mean, percentage-wise, this is equivalent to Sowell's situation, but it's a little bit ridiculous because that's not what actually happens.
Well, he's done it. He's done it on increments of 10K, so
Yeah,
it
but
doesn't double
percentage,
it. Um,
yeah.
yeah.
But percentage-wise, it's a little bit, it does double after the first time, between
Yes.
10, between 20 and 30. Yeah, between
Yeah.
20 and 30, and 30 and 40 doubles, and then it doubles again between 30 and 40, and between 50 and 60.
No, I'm looking at it now. It goes 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. So it just goes
Yeah,
up in 10K increments. So I
yeah.
guess,
But what I'm saying is, after 10 years it doubles, and then after another 20 years it doubles again.
yes, okay. Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah. Yeah, that doesn't happen in real life, though.
No, no, okay, but I think the point that he was making there is that it's very easy to mislead on statistics like this. So, like, what does it mean
Yeah.
in this scenario for somebody to be in the top 5%, say, as opposed to the top, and what does it mean to be in the bottom 10%?
I
Um,
agree.
and I was actually thinking about this with myself, and also with you. I mean, are you doing a PhD at the moment? What's your situation? Are you doing a
I'm in
degree or?
Yeah, I'm in grad school right now. I'm working on applications of chaos theory and nonlinear physics to uh, biological systems.
Okay, and I mean, can I ask how old you are?
I am 22.
So you're 22 at the moment, and presumably you don't get a great income for like your wage in 10 years time is going to be more than what you're on now, I'd
Oh,
imagine,
oh yeah, definitely.
regardless of. And I was thinking, like, so obviously I'm a little bit older. I'm 34. Okay, so if I just take my wage now versus where I was when I was your age, for example, or even before that, like my first job was in McDonald's, or in uh, even before that, I worked in like a bakery section on £2.18 an hour. Okay, £2.18 an hour. Now, you can see that while I was like doing my studies, or while you're doing your studies, you would actually show up in those income statistics that the government uses to then justify. So when they talk about poverty, if people like me and you are showing up in those, what does that mean? Or like my income in real times is actually it's much more than 100% increase from 22 to now. I would say it's, more like 500% increase. It just goes up massively. Um, so do you understand that the point he's making?
Yeah,
Or like my
yeah.
father when he retires in a
No,
couple of
I
years.
agree. I agree with the
Yeah,
point. Yeah,
yeah,
I agree with the point that he's making. That you can misrepresent general income inequality. I just like the problem here is in the fact that the studies are cross sectional. They look at, they freeze society at one point in time, and they say this is how society is over time, when in fact they should be doing a longitudinal study. They should be following the way people are making money over their lifetimes, and the manner, the extent to which they save, and all of these other various variables.
hmm
uh, you were
the,
saying about your dad?
I was just saying that, like, my father now, he's coming up to retirement age, but he has a 3-story house. He has had, he'll have. I mean, in real terms, nobody would say that I am more wealthy than my father. Okay,
Yeah.
but when he retires in the income statistics, I will be in whatever percentage, and he will then suddenly show up in a, in he will show up towards the bottom based on income, or even like a Goldman Sachs banker who has a house with a pool. If he loses his job tomorrow, he will then show up in poverty statistics. And the reason this is important is because it comes up, like, even now, in this country. The Labour Party are currently, we've just had an election announced, and the Labour Party are running on this platform where they want to increase taxes on the rich, quote unquote. But how are they defining the rich? It's anybody who earns £70,000 or more. Well,
Okay.
that includes all sorts of people, and if you take it as an income, it would, like my partner here, she, that's basically what she earns. But we live in London. That is, like, that doesn't make us rich by any stretch of the imagination. In this street I'm living on, I couldn't afford to buy the house 2 doors down because it cost £4 million to buy that. So in real terms, that's not really wealth, is it? But they're still using it. They're still using that calculation to try to push a policy based on these exactly the same sort of statistics that Sowell is talking about. So, and anyway, were there any other arguments that you thought weren't very compelling?
Uh, Well, with this particular argument, I just want to suggest that if it was more incremental, if instead of it was a jump of 10,000 a year when you start with 10,000 and you have all this doubling taking place, instead of that you had a more incremental growth, you had a more complicated system, um, where, and of course everybody's saving different amounts, everybody's spending different amounts, everybody has different family situations. It's a little bit ridiculous that everybody subsists on $5,000 a year. It's like, what, you don't send your kids to school or anything? It's like, come on.
Right.
uh,
Yeah.
but um, and of course this alternative argument would, I think, weigh in Sal's favor, because it would show that there's really no way of accounting for all of these different variables and the manner in which all of these factors play out, and how they all affect income, uh, much less on how to respond to that.
Right.
But a couple arguments I did take serious issue with. He mentioned, toward the end,
Mm-hmm.
a case of student or a couple of parents who tried to sue the school district because their student did not want to learn evolution from the classroom. They wanted an alternative assignment instead.
Right.
I kind of take issue with that. Sowell seemed to think that that person should have been allowed to have their religious convictions unchallenged by the public education system. I think that if you have the license to avoid a scientific topic based solely on your convictions, you have the license to avoid any topic based on any conviction. And at that point, you have no business in a public school system because you're not meeting the standards that are set for everybody. Uh,
Yeah, and I think during that part where he was talking about schools, he seemed to be saying that basically the state is taking away parents' rights to know what their children are being educated. And I guess as a libertarian, he thinks that's a bad idea, and is actually, I think, maybe even against the idea of state education. Like this, why is the state deciding what people should and shouldn't learn? I guess was his point. Um, and I guess of all his arguments, that would be the one I would be is the, it could lead to terrible places. I guess if you suddenly have people deciding what picking and choosing what people learn at school. But then I don't know. I kind of go a few ways on that because let's just pretend for a second that um, you had children and you'd sent them to school, and you found out that at school they were really pushing SJW propaganda all the
mhm.
time
Yeah.
on the kids, and you have no control over that because it's a state school. Would you as a parent not want to intervene or try to have some say against that sort of thing?
I would send them to private school. Um, the state decides that there's a certain minimum standard that students need to meet, and the people who decide what this minimum standard is, sometimes they are not competent, sometimes they are ideologically motivated.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and in the case of this SJWism, that would certainly seem to be the case. Uh, but there is a minimum standard that does need to be met. It is imperfect, and I guess there's no solution. Again, there's a trade-off. Um, are you prepared to uh, what kind of costs are you willing to accept versus what kind of benefits in terms of free public education are you willing to get? There's some schools, particularly in urban areas, that are basically worthless for the purposes of public education. Um, people are trying to get the hell out of urban areas and move into the suburbs, into rural areas, into places where they can actually get a decent education, even if they cost them more, because the alternative is to not pay and to get kind of an anti-education. It's just a breeding ground for all kinds of social ills.
Right. And I guess his point would be public school in itself is something that is the vision of the, part of the vision of the anointed. And you've replaced market power with political power. So you get this situation where you have areas with bad schools and areas with good schools, and they're almost always coincident with the sort of parents in the, if you have middle class parents in an area, they're good at political power, so they can put pressure on schools. Whereas in those poor areas where parents are less invested, or they don't know any better, or that they're just not the sort of people who are going to kick up and make a fuss, um, that doesn't happen. So you get this terrible disparity between, I guess that's the libertarian argument against public education. Um, I don't know what the answer is, though. I honestly don't.
I think the answer is you set a minimum standard, and the minimum standard, the disparity can still exist. It's the same as my opinion on the welfare state. I'm okay with there being income disparity. Um, I just want there to be some kind of minimum standard, some kind of safety net that people can rely on, at least temporarily, in order to be able to pick themselves up. And of course, this was the original intention, as Saul pointed out, of Johnson's Great Society program, but that this did not end up working out, and people congratulated themselves, patted themselves on the back for keeping people above the poverty line when that wasn't exactly the intention. The intention was to um, give them the means to contribute to society, to invest in them, to be able to get returns. That's not what happened.
And I guess this is his main problem with the vision of the anointed, is that you can never tell how a particular policy is going to change incentives. And I guess the point with welfare is that even if it's brought in for the best of intentions, and with the best will in the world, after a while you've changed the incentives, and then the natural order of things is curbed. Um, I mean, the example I would always give is in the valleys of Wales, when the mines closed down in the late 70s and the early 80s. There was a very robust welfare state there. So all of these people who lost their jobs, who would have been miners and suddenly were unemployed, they all went on to welfare. Now, what would have happened if the welfare state had not been there? Yeah, they would have had a couple of rough years, but most of them would have either innovated out of necessity, or they would have got up and moved. They would have gone to somebody like New York, or some other place where there was work for them, which would have them. And all across history, that is what has happened, apart from in cases where welfare has essentially taken away the incentives to do anything about it, and then trapped people in cycles of poverty.
Yeah, I don't like that aspect of welfare. I don't like the kind of welfare that results in this sort of dependence. If it was up to me, I would institute these policies that would basically ensure that people who are qualified, who are able-bodied, and who are basically able to work would work. But right now there's obviously a bunch of ways around that. We have all these stupid loopholes. A person can go to their doctor and say, doctor, I'm having trouble breathing. I give me an inhaler, and the doctor writes a note saying he has asthma. He goes to the social services department. He goes up to the clerk, says, "Hey, I got this note from the doctor saying that I have asthma. I can't work. Um, you know, give me disability money." And they collect a check. They get EBT, and they sort of uh, that's kind of at least part of their income.
Mm-hmm.
And this is completely possible under sort of the sort of how flexible and how lax the standards are for giving out welfare.
Yeah, I know. But well, my mother actually worked in the job centre for years. In fact, in this very same area in Wales that I'm talking about, and she said, there were people there. Some people genuinely did want to find work, but there were people there who had absolutely no intention of looking for a job or getting off benefits at all. It was obvious they were just going so they could tick a kind of government box, so the welfare wasn't taken away from them. So you can see directly the incentives at play.
Mm-hmm.
The very fact that it's possible shows that the incentives have change. And I guess this is Sowell's argument over and over again. It doesn't matter what it is. It could be affirmative action, which is something I know that he's dead against, or it could be any of these things. Some of the more interesting example, like, so if you'd asked me before I read this book, are you for sex education? Okay, this is one of the ones that he goes on about, and I was interested. Because generally we think, I mean, we're both educated people, I guess, in been to university, so we tend to think that something like sex education would be a good thing. But did his arguments against, did his, I guess, the data showing that sex education actually had the opposite effect of what it was intended to achieve, change your thinking on sex education at all?
I'm not sure that I'm convinced. I can't recall if he said that this accounted for this data was normalized to account for population growth. You have to remember that this data would have been taken, just as the baby boomer generation was coming of age.
Right. Yeah.
So you have the sudden population explosion, and of course, if the percentages, if you say in raw terms, in just the number of people has gone up 150%, the number of teen pregnancies has gone up 150%, but you don't normalize for population growth. That can be quite misleading, which ironically is something that Sowell was railing against.
Yeah, he talks about the rates of infection for gonorrhea, for example. He says it declined every year from 1950 through to 1959. But then when sex education is introduced, it basically tribbles. And then by,
Yeah, but
and then by
this was the
1980,
time.
it's gone up by
This is the
5
time.
times.
Yeah, but this is the time the baby boomer generation was coming of age, though. I mean, I don't know if maybe he has a point, maybe he doesn't. I would have to look into the data, but from what I know here in the States, we have 2, maybe 3 states. I know at least 2 states that have abstinence only sex education.
Okay.
One of those states has more teen pregnancies per capita than any other state, and the other state,
Right.
the other one is not in first place; it's in second place. This is Texas, but they are first place in the number of repeat teen pregnancies.
And these are the ones that are preaching abstinence. But you see, there again, the incentives are changed. So you get that kind of, I forget what the name of the effect is, but whenever you try to ban something outright, or really caution people against, don't push that red button,
Mm-hmm.
people weirdly are drawn to do just the opposite of that.
Yeah.
Um,
I think it's
and
Streisand effect.
what's it called? Sorry.
I think it's Streisand effect.
Yeah, I mean, you could look at something like prohibition, or look at prostitution in Iran, for example. Like, the more they try to stamp on these things, the more people have a will to do them. So I'm not actually surprised that to find out those statistics that you mentioned.
Well, what do you do then? Do you like not? Do you tell them absolutely nothing about sex? Do you just pretend it doesn't exist? I mean, they're going to find out on their own one way or the other, I'm sure.
Well, I think I mean, he doesn't say it, because this is the thing that is a little bit frustrating about Sowell sometimes, is that he'll lay out the critique, but he never offers his own solution or his own view. In a way, he just kind of destroys their point of view and doesn't say what should have happened instead. But I think, knowing what I do about his general positions, that he would say, well, is sex education a question for the state to answer, or is that really up to the parents? Is that a conversation that you have with your father? Or is it something that everybody has to learn through experience? It's just part of being human. Like, why do we need a bunch of people in schools telling people about sex? So I don't know, what would your view be?
Well, I think maybe a collaboration between the schools and medical programs, the hospitals, to sort of say, we have these resources. be able to educate students about some of the hazards that come along with unprotected sex. The way sex education happened in my high school, for example, they would it was the same with drug education. They would show us, they would introduce us to basically all the different STDs, all of the different possible things that could happen, and they would show us pictures as well. But it wasn't meant to scare us away from sex. They said, everything, the moral of every story was always wear a condom, always get tested. I thought that was a decent policy.
His statistic. I've just found the section here. He says a sex education program spread widely through the American educational system during the 1970s. The pregnancy rate among 15 to 19-year-old females rose from approximately 68 per thousand in 1970 to approximately 96 per thousand by 1980. Among unmarried girls in the 15 to 17-year-old bracket, birth rates rose 29% between 1970 and 1984, despite a massive increase in abortion, which more than doubled during the same period. Among girls under 15, the number of
hold on, which more than doubled in the same period.
Yeah.
Roe v. Wade was only passed in, 72, I think?
Right. So between 1970 and 84, abortions doubled in that period, but the birth rate still rose by 29%. Okay. Which suggests that massively more teenage girls were giving birth in that period.
Okay, I see.
Despite the fact that lots of them were being aborted, it still rose 29%. Mm-hmm. So teenage gonorrhea tripled between 1956 and 75. So, I mean, I guess he's just saying that the statistics just don't show any benefit to this policy at all. And if we're looking for empirical research for social policy, I guess, I mean, is there any way of arguing against this?
Well, maybe we could look at more recent data, because maybe the kind of sex education has changed between then and now. I wasn't around in the 70s, so I couldn't tell you what the curriculum was back then, but I thought that my curriculum in high school was very good and very informative and probably did help.
The other one that he really goes to town on is Lyndon B. Johnson's crime reforms, where they were looking to rehabilitate criminals as opposed to a kind of more punitive justice system, which I guess tries to give people incentives not to do crime through discipline and law and order and punishment, which I guess is a typical like Republican platform. Did that change your view on crime at all? Did you think that we need a harsher crime?
I think that what really made me think a lot was when he said that he asked, what is the function of the law? Is the point to try to achieve some kind of standard of society where you prevent people from committing crimes? Is that the kind of legal system we're trying to get? Or is the function of the law to try to minimize the number of people who suffer, to try to enforce the terms of the social contract in order to make everybody's life a little bit less harsh, less nasty, less brutish, less short? And this criminal justice reform that took place in that period seemed to be a shift away from protecting law-abiding citizens in favor of moving toward this utopian vision of the anointed.
And protecting criminals' rights and things like that. He says crime rates skyrocketed. Murder rates suddenly shot up until the murder rate in 1974 was more than twice as high as in 1961. Between 1960 and 76, a citizen's chances of becoming a victim of a major crime tripled. The number of policemen killed also tripled during the decade of the 1960s. Young criminals, who had been especially favored by the new solicitude, became especially violent. The arrest rate of juveniles for murder more than tripled between 1965 and 1990, even allowing for changes in population size. And then he goes on to say that when Nixon tried to crack down on all of this, they said it was about race and not crime. They kind of shifted the goalposts again. So there we go. Okay. One of the things that you said on Twitter that interested me was that you thought that Sowell's argument in this book is compatible with the center left, which is interesting because I often feel that Sowell is coming from pretty hard right wing position on a lot of these things. Do you want to elaborate on how you think this is compatible with center left thinking?
Well, I think that if you take to heart the criticisms, which any good, and anybody who really wants to think about these issues, if you take to heart these criticisms, and you say, okay, the implementation of the welfare state to achieve a certain teleology, to achieve a certain kind of end, this vision of the anointed, not necessarily a good idea. The moral of this whole thing was basically you have to look at things in terms of immediate cost benefit, and you can't, try to be pushing toward a utopian future. And this leaves the room open for reforms like a welfare state, um, provided that it's implemented in a manner that doesn't have this kind of utopian teleology. It has to serve some kind of pragmatic function. Um, it has to be, like I mentioned, the welfare state. If I could make my own society, my welfare state would not really so much be done out of compassion for the poor as it would be an attempt to invest in them in order to achieve some kind of return that'll ultimately be for the better of society. Um, yeah.
So you'd want to try to find a way to make sure they're not starving, but get them into work or get them trained up and doing something.
Yeah.
How could
Well,
you
they
do
can't
that
be.
though?
They,
Carry
well,
on.
well, it's actually something I've been thinking about a lot lately. I've been thinking, how do we take care of the urban poor? How do we get them out of poverty, and how to keep them away from welfare dependence? I'm thinking first step is to set up certain welfare policies, saying if you're able-bodied, according to so and so standard, if you uh, and so you cannot have permanent welfare. You have welfare for this long, and in the meantime, you have to go to these job training programs. And in particular, the job training programs would be in things like programming,
Mm-hmm.
in basic computer science. Um, this is the 21st century economy, and in an age where everybody owns an iPod or an iPhone. I don't see why this would be particularly troubling to implement. I think ultimately it could pay for itself, as long as you have both this carrot and the stick. The carrot is you get the job training that will allow you to get a 21st century job. You can work in an office. You can actually make something of yourself, and you can make a living. You can start making more money than you would have made if you just sat at home and took welfare. The stick is if you don't do that, then the state will stop giving you welfare, and you can go ahead and starve.
Right. Okay. Well, I mean, I guess there'd be some argument to say, well, why even bother having the carrot? Just take it away, and then see, like, then
Well,
basically necessity drives them to do something about it.
well, what kind of jobs do they end up taking them? They end up taking menial, crappy jobs that are, it's. I don't think ultimately it's going to be profitable.
But
there are only so many janitors a person can hire. There are only so many, so many toilet scrubbers you can have in a company. Um, Whereas if you have people who are capable of doing mid-level work, um, being under the supervision of middle management and being able to sort of, being able to do slightly higher level work. Um, you have all these new job markets opening up in the digital sector. Um, you
okay.
there is room for them to move into that sector, I think, and I think that it'll ultimately be for the better of society. You're going to improve the GDP. These welfare programs will pay for themselves, and I think you're also you're going to have an accompanying reduction of the kind of social ills that come with welfare dependence as well.
Do you think, though, there's not a danger in this way of talking of kind of, even us talking about this, seeing the poor as a problem that we need to solve, as opposed to,
No, that's not the way I'm seeing it. My goal is not to. Yeah. Here's a point I really want to emphasize.
sure.
I'm not trying to frame this as helping the poor. I realize the dangers in framing it that way. I'm trying to frame this as how can we. I guess the best term is sublimate. Normally, I use the term how do we do a kind of special alchemy where we turn shit into gold, but I realize that would be unflattering in this context. Uh, so the goal is how do we increase the GDP in a way that is going to be smart and helpful. And I think there may be potential here.
Oh, okay, all right, okay. So, and you think that all down the line, you don't actually have to um, destroy these leftist or social kind of socialist schemes. You just need to reorientate them in such a way that is going to work with the parameters that Sowell sets up in this book.
Yeah,
Something like that.
the goal is not to achieve a more righteous utopian equal society. The goal is to achieve a society that functions and performs better.
Yeah, to be honest, if I have any criticism of Sowell at all, it is that it's almost like once something like the NHS or the welfare state is up and running, okay, and it's been there for a number of years, even if it's had terrible results, okay, the reality of the situation has changed. So for right or for wrong, the reality is different. And I feel like often Sowell's position is, oh God, it should never have been done in the first place. Whereas as a pragmatist, my thought is, yes, but it is there now. So what can we do now? And in so many of the cases, taking it away isn't really an option. So this more kind of middle ground that you're talking about seems more practical to me. Even if I'm not sure if I call it I just call it, I guess, pragmatic, because reality changes, right? Reality is changed by the sorts of plans that people put in place, even if they're bad ones. Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
Okay, and so this brings me on to my last question, which is, do you think Sowell leaves enough scope for change? In some ways, do we actually need the anointed vision as a driver for change, even if it is almost always wrong?
Yes, and whatchamacallit, I want to go back to Tolstoy for a second because there's a criticism I have of him. The way Tolstoy criticizes the historians and their view of Napoleon, it seems as though one consequence of his suggestion that this is all bottom up is that Napoleon's disciplining and training of his troops and their spirit, his imbuing them with spirit and his tactical genius, that this had absolutely nothing to do with his successes, that Napoleon just got lucky, that everybody
Right.
in history who was successful, but for the will of God, so to speak. Um, and I'm not sure I agree with that. I do think that Napoleon's victories did have something to do with his competence. I do think that the burning of Rome had something to do with Nero's incompetence. I think that there is, the top doesn't dictate everything that happens, but I think they do play a non-negligible role um, in orienting the direction in which things move. If you get what I'm saying.
Oh, absolutely. And I don't actually think that would be incompatible with the constrained vision, because it kind of makes sense. If you think that people respond to incentives and people tend towards behaving a certain way, it also stands to reason that you can be a good leader, right?
Yeah.
Because, people are predictable in some ways. I was actually thinking about this earlier, this question of the scope for change and where does it come from? Like, what sorts of utopian thinking are good and what sorts of utopian thinking are bad? Um, And I invariably started thinking about science, actually. Like, you know, Silicon Valley, for example, is almost like a generator of, I guess, utopian ideas. Um, and they just kind of do things because they can.
Mhm.
Like, say Facebook or Twitter, for example. No, they don't need to exist, really, do they? I mean, but they do exist, and somebody made them just because they could, and unleashed them onto the world without even thinking about any of the consequences or anything. And they
Yep.
have had a big impact on society. You'd agree. Um, and I was thinking, like, is that good? Would you say that's evolutionary? That's a good thing,
I think it just is what it is. I think it's morally neutral.
right? And that's going to happen no matter what. That people are going to make change. So, but that doesn't work in the arena of politics. But that works in the arena of like technology or of. I was also thinking about like Walt Disney. Nobody was asking for there to be a massive theme park in the marshlands of
Yeah.
Florida, or even like nobody was really asking for there to be feature length cartoons until he envisaged them. But then he made them and people came. So he kind of like made his own reality. They call it what, magical thinking. He made his own reality.
Yeah.
Um, is that an example of a kind of good vision of
Yeah.
utopia?
Well, I think I see where you're getting. I think it all ultimately comes back to what you think the function of the government is. Um, you have on one extreme people who think that the function of the government is to take care of the people. On the other extreme, the function of the government is to just enforce the social contract and nothing else. And I fall in a more of a middle position where I think that the function of the government is to, yes, enforce the social contract, but this also encompasses creating a state of affairs where you can accommodate people's capacity to sublimate their desires, to achieve their aspirations, um, and having a sort of minimum standard from which people will have a shot at achieving their goals.
Right. So almost like a kind of government that this encourages entrepreneurship or innovation or something like this.
Yeah, yeah, and provides this sort of bare minimum that's necessary um, to actually have a launch pad to jump off of. Whereas you have social justice types who think no, 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 this minimum is too small. We have to start everybody off at a sort of an equal starting point. And we have to
Yeah.
change the institutions and everything in order to get everything perfectly equal and achieve this kind of cosmic justice. I'm not
Yeah.
interested in this cosmic justice. I'm just interested in getting people out there and improving everybody else's quality of life as well as their own. Uh,
Yeah. And I should mention Sowell has a third book. I think it actually forms an unofficial trilogy: Conflict of Visions, Vision of the Anointed, and then a book called The Quest for Cosmic Justice, where he basically says, well, this society that they want has never existed at any point in history. So there's
yep.
no reason to try to get that equality of outcome because it's never going to happen for various different reasons. Like he even goes into like there may actually be a reason why some stratas of society are drawn towards certain jobs um, more than others. For example, like I mean, in this country, um, I don't mean Native Americans, I mean Indians from the subcontinent,
Mhm.
of which we have a bigger number in this country than I think you guys do in, per percentage, because I guess we had the Commonwealth and there was a big wave of migration in the 1960s. But of doctors who are also British Indian massively, massively over index as a proportion versus how many of them there are in society. There must be a reason for that, right? It's not. Um, there must be reasons for that other than um, random distribution.
It's
You see what I'm saying?
agenticity. Are you familiar with agenticity?
What is that? No.
It's a psychological bias that's inherent to human beings, and it begins to show itself in childhood. And if it doesn't, that's one of the signs that a person has autism. But basically, it's the attribution of motivated causal agency where none really exists. So a child might you might ask a child what is the point of the stripes of a tiger? What is the purpose of a tiger's stripes?
Mm-hmm.
And the child might answer, so the tiger can show how beautiful he is. What is the point of that mountain? What is the function of that mountain? You ask the child. The child answers, well, it's the so we have something to climb.
Right. Okay. Yes.
Yeah. So this kind of this is what we call agenticity.
Right.
I, I read a book about it, but it was a long time ago, so I don't remember the details. But if you look into it, you might be interested in making a video or something about how this might lead people into assuming that differentials in outcome are the result of motivated causal agency.
Right. Yeah. It's and that is basically the problem all the time, is seeing intention, like seeing deliberate intention where there is none. It may just be, I'm just putting it out there, that more, say, Indian parents put a premium on being doctors than parents of other backgrounds. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that, yes, okay, if you have that set of values, you're going to produce that set of outcomes. But that entire way of thinking is completely taboo when you start, looking around at the causes of various different social ills, even though it's basic common sense. But you're not even allowed to say it in these various debates. I mean, if I said that at a university, I'd probably be called all sorts of things, racist probably.
Yeah, yeah.
So anyway, was there anything else you wanted to comment on? That was
I think we covered all bases. Actually, it was pretty good.
great. All right. Well, it was very good to talk to you. And if anyone's made it this far, I would recommend checking out all of those books by Thomas Sowell. He definitely gives you stuff to think about, I think. And I mean, by the end of the book, did any of your basic political assumptions, were they altered in any way? Were they changed?
To a certain extent, they were supplemented and in some ways reinforced. I got a pretty decent criticism of my ideas, and it allowed me to respond in certain ways that I might not have been able to otherwise, because my exposure to this criticism allowed me to alter my position. No, not so much alter my position, but alter the orientation of my position.
Yeah, it definitely made me think of, I guess, start to question some of the things I'd always taken for granted. Even if you held a gun to my head, I'd probably still say sex education is a good thing. It definitely made me think we don't often think through the logic of why things exist and why we defend them. So, and I guess that's his clarity as a writer is able to make you do that. So,
Yeah.
anyway, good to talk to you.
Likewise. I hope we'll have some opportunity to chat again sometime.